I'm not going to give you a whole lot of my history and background because it takes a little time, but people want to know how'd you get from practicing law for 48 years to being involved in rebuilding a steam locomotive, and it was kind of an interesting process, but in a short part of it, I just happened to stumble across the website, and I was looking for something to do when I quit practicing law at the end of 2017 after 48 years, including representing a lot of companies down here in Wilson County. And I went out and I said, well, I'd like to volunteer. And they said, well, as a lawyer, do you know how to weld? And I said, no, I don't know how to weld. And said, can you use an acetylene torch? I said, no, I don't know how to use an acetylene torch. I said, I do know which end of a screwdriver to hold. I know the difference between a crescent wrench and a box end wrench, and I can probably find something to do. So they enlisted me, and they realized that I was used to standing up and talking to people. So they said, well, we need somebody to do some presentation. So that's been my role a lot for the last year. I'm now a member of the board, and I appreciate y'all coming and giving us a chance to make this presentation. You know, we're really excited about the project. A lot of things have happened over the last few months. When I first got involved a year ago, the engine was still in the park. There was a lot of work being done on it, but because it was in a public place, there were some things that just couldn't be done. So let me start out. When I first got involved in this project, one of my son-in-laws, who reads a lot of nonfiction works, sent me a copy of Stephen Ambrose's book, Nothing Like It in the World, which is the story of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a really interesting book. And it's amazing what those folks were able to accomplish in 1868 and 1869, building a 2,000-mile railroad through the mountains and the prairies and fighting Indians and everything else. But when they started the project, the Union Pacific Railroad put together a tour train for him to go on the route of the railroad, which still runs pretty much on the same original route. They publicized the route that the train would take, when it would be at certain little towns along the way, and where it would pass over overpasses. And all along the route, he was amazed by the crowds that turned out just to see their steam engine, number 844, pulling this excursion train. They were at every overpass, every bridge, everywhere the highway paralleled the tracks. There were just mobs of people that truck drivers would stop and stand on the tops of the cabs of their trucks and take pictures with their phones of this steam engine going along the track. So he realized, he said, America has lost its heart to steam locomotives. There are a lot of folks in this room who probably remember some steam locomotives, but there are a lot more folks out there who've never seen a real steam locomotive in action and heard it and smelled it and seen what it's like. You know, kids have seen Thomas the Tank Engine or stuff on the cartoons, but not the real live thing. So this is a little quick video of the engine pulling into one of those little towns, this is the kind of excitement we believe this engine is going to create, both in downtown Nashville, Mount Juliet, here in Lebanon, and in Watertown, and on up the rails farther when we get to that point. As you can see, the kind of excitement the engine goes. This is engine number 844, which is virtually identical. It's a little bit larger than 576. But it's a 484 engine that the Union Pacific restored and uses to pull excursion trains all over the West. You know, belonging to the Union Pacific, they get to run it on their live rails, so it can go a lot of places. But this is the kind of excitement that it generates. So I'm going to give you a quick history about the National Steam Preservation Society. It was formed in 2016 to raise the money and to enlist volunteers to start working on the restoration of the engine. The first thing they did was they entered into a lease with the city of Nashville. The engine actually belongs to the city of Nashville. We have a 24-year lease that's $1 a year essentially, that allowed 4 years for the restoration project and then 20 years of operating the engine before it would have to be renewed. The lease did call for the NSPS to raise $500,000, $500,000 in cash that were in the bank before it could be moved out of the park. They wanted to make sure they had enough wherewithal to actually go through the restoration project and not just, get started and then run out of gas. NSPS is a nonprofit organization. We have been in the fundraising business, and now that we've got the engine out of the park, the fundraising is getting to be one of our most important projects. Quick history, the NC St. L Railroad was chartered in Nashville in 1845. 5 years later, the L&N was chartered in Louisville. The NC and St. L was headquartered in Nashville and operated independently until 1957, and it's now part, as you know, of the CSX system. The NC and St. L ran primarily between Nashville and Atlanta, and Nashville and then west up to St. Louis. They leased tracks from the Western and Atlantic Railroad from Chattanooga to Atlanta. The famous steam locomotive chase involving the General and the Texas actually took place on that railroad line. The Texas engine, we were just down in Atlanta 10 days ago. The Texas, which was the engine that chased down the General, actually was an NC and St. L engine at the end of its career. So it's pretty much like 576. Union Station was built in 1900. The NC and St. L headquarters was located right across Broadway on this picture. The building that's right at the edge of that picture is the old NC and St. L office building. Back in the days when these engines were built and running, back in the, from the time that steam became the method of moving people around and freight in the 1800s, if you wanted to go somewhere, you went on a passenger train. Not until the late 40s was passenger air traffic really become the norm. The L&N and the NC and St. L had a number of named trains, and this is a picture of the schedule board that's actually in the lobby of the Union Station Hotel now. These engines were actually ordered because of World War II. The NC and St. L realized when the war broke out that there was going to be a lot of material and a lot of soldiers who were going to be moved around in the southeast. So they ordered 10 new engines from the American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York. They were locomotives that would be strong enough to pull freight trains and fast enough to pull passenger trains. The head of mechanical works for the NC and St. L was a man named Clarence Darden. He basically designed these engines. They had a predecessor, a group of engines that had ordered in 1930 that were still in service, but they were getting a little long in the tooth. So he had a lot of upgrades to make to these engines to make them more efficient, more powerful, and faster. This is a picture of actually a sister engine to 576 that was rolled out of the shops in Schenectady. The 576 was delivered in August of 1942 and went to work pulling trains primarily from Nashville to Memphis and from Nashville to Chattanooga and on to Atlanta. There are a lot of innovations on this engine, which is one thing that makes it a prime candidate for restoration. It was sort of a state-of-the-art steam locomotive. Steam locomotives are classified according to their wheel arrangement under the engine. This is what's called a 484 engine. The lead truck has 4 wheels. It has 8 drive wheels. And the trailing truck, which is underneath the firebox, has 4 wheels. Some of these engines had been built for some of the North Midwestern railroads, and they were referred to as Northerns. The NC and St. L didn't want to call these engines Northerns, so they dubbed them Dixies, and that's what it was known as a Dixie. There are some of the innovations on this engine. They specified Timken roller bearings on all the axles, which were much freer moving axles, easier. You'll notice that along the boiler, the main part of the engine, there are no pipes. I'll show you some pictures in a minute or two of some of the older engines that were covered with both steam, water, and airline pipes all along the side of the engine. But Mr. Darden wanted a clean engine. He wanted all the pipes underneath where they didn't show. This engine also had a one-piece cast steel frame and the cylinders for the steam pistons. So it was all cast in one piece. It had what are called lateral motion devices under the front 2 drivers. The NC and St. L tracks had a lot of fairly sharp curves for an engine of this size, but those devices allowed the engine to have some give to it as it went around the curves and made it a much smoother running engine. So it was the locomotive weight, the engine weighed about 400,000 pounds with the tender full that carried 15,000 gallons of water, 16 tons of coal. So the overall heavy loaded weight of the engine in tender was about 600,000 pounds. The speed it could run as high as 90 miles an hour. Actually, when the first 2 or 3 engines were delivered, one of the engineers asked Mr. Darden, said, "Mr. Darden, how fast will these engines run?" He said, "Well, how fast have you had it?" He said, "Well, we held it down to over 100, and then we sort of lost our nerve and slowed down a little bit. But there weren't many places they could run that fast, but it was an engine that had plenty of speed." The cost of the engine new was about $170,000. When they took them out of service in 1952, the scrap value was about $8,000. This is a picture of 576 in service. When the engine was delivered from Alco, it had a skirt, which you can see on the side. This is not in color, but we have some color pictures in a minute, that was painted yellow, and they called it the Yellow Jacket. And you'll notice that the nose of the engine, where the headlight is, was a sort of a semi-streamlined nose, which the mechanics discovered when they got to work on the engines on a regular basis was kind of a pain, so they changed that, and I'll show you a picture of how they modified it. But as I said, this is a Class J3 484 locomotive. It's a dual-purpose locomotive that could haul both passenger trains and freight trains. This actually shows the engine in service. The one at the top still has the skirt on it, and the one to the right-hand side, after they took the skirt off, they kept the stripe, and it became known as a yellow stripe, and that's what we refer to it today as the stripe. Well, all things had to come to an end. By the end of the 40s, the railroads were beginning to get diesel locomotives to pull primarily passenger trains. They couldn't buy diesel locomotives during the war effort because the war board was prohibited them from buying diesel engines to pull passenger trains. They could use them to pull freight trains, but not passenger trains. But by the late 40s, diesels were beginning to take over. So engine 576 and its 20 siblings that were built in 42 and 43 were put on the deadline at the NC and St. L yards, which were just north of Centennial Park, between the park and Charlotte Avenue, where the HCA buildings are today. One of the councilmen, just like a member of your commission up here, from Nashville's ward, was in the district where the NC and St. L headquarters was located in the Roundhouse. He went to the president of the NC and St. L and asked if they would be willing to give one of the engines to the city of Nashville and not just scrap it for the $8,000. And they agreed to that. The city agreed to accept it. So a short spur track was built. From the yard into Centennial Park, and that's a picture of the engine actually being moved into the park in September of 1953. There's a boy you'll see up on the front of the engine. His name is Tommy Knowles, and Tommy Knowles is a little older than I am now. He's in his 70s, and he is one of the volunteers who's working on this engine. So he saw it put into the park, and he saw it taken out of the park. You'll notice here on the front of the engine that the semi-streamlined nose has been changed. They put a smoke box cover on there with a hinge so they could just open it up and get into the smoke box and didn't have to have a crane to take it off. The engine had a lot of publicity over its years in the park. Johnny Cash had a photograph made in front of it for Life magazine. There were a lot of other pictures made for different publications. Several generations of Nashvillians and their kids have climbed on the engine and played on it. But sitting out in the open, which it did until about 15 years ago, the elements began to take their toll and things were beginning to deteriorate. And there were a couple of efforts to get the engine out of the park and do a restoration, but none of those groups were able to accomplish what the NSPS has done. In short, the plan is to rebuild the engine, put it back in operating condition. It won't be just a cosmetic rebuild. It's all the way from the wheels up. It's a pretty long process, but the idea is to get it in operation. As you all know, the Tennessee Central Railroad Museum runs trains through Lebanon to Watertown, on up to Cookeville and Monterey. This engine will pull the same cars that they're using today for their diesel excursion trains, and we think that the steam engine itself will attract a lot of attention that the diesel engines don't. They also pull their trains out of the Tennessee Central Museum out off of Hermitage Avenue, which if you've ever been there, is kind of buried. It's a little hard to find, hard to get to. Our goal is to actually use the same tracks that the Star runs on and stops in downtown at the foot of Broadway, that these trains will run from the foot of Broadway, which the convention people are pretty excited about to use for things, for excursions, for people coming here for conventions. The preservation is important because this is an engine that was designed in Nashville. It operated in and out of Nashville. It's been in Nashville virtually its whole life, and so preserving it as a piece of history is an important goal. There's an educational aspect of it. There's the work that's going to be done on the engine involves, as I mentioned, welding, cutting, and plumbing. The steam engine has lots of pipes running on it. It has air pipes, it has water pipes, steam pipes. We plan to partner up with some of the vocational schools and some of the high schools in the area for some of their shop classes to have kids come down and actually take part in the sessions, and there's some pretty skilled people that are volunteers, unlike me as a lawyer, but the people that actually do know how to weld and how to take things apart and put them back together, that will be beneficial to them. We're going to conduct public tours on the weekends where it's out in the middle of the yard, but we're going to have hopefully a short video to give a little history of the engine, and then lead tours out while the engine is actually being redone, which is about a 2-year project. This is a picture of an engine that was redone up in Fort Wayne, Indiana. A very similar engine. It's actually a Berkshire, which is a 284 instead of a 484, but virtually the same size and type of engine. It has been very successful up there in drawing crowds. They don't have as much track to run on as we have for this engine. You know, this is the three things that make engines like this successful. There's number one, the nature of the engine itself that makes it unique and it's worth preserving and for people to come to see. Number two is the crowds that we already have in Nashville. We have, thousands of people coming in every weekend. I'm so glad I'm not working anymore because our office was on 3rd Avenue I've been right in the middle of the NFL mess, and it's bad enough just during the country music week and all the other times. But we've got folks coming, and we've got track. We've got 100 miles of track from Nashville up to Cookeville, so there's track to run on, and we've got the consist of passenger cars to pull behind the train. This is another engine very similar up in Norfolk or Roanoke, Virginia. This is one that was a streamlined model, but it's the same configuration of 484 engine that has attracted a lot of visitors to Roanoke, which is nowhere near the size of Nashville and doesn't have the ready-made tourism visitation. But those engines have been self-sustaining, and that's what we believe, that this engine will be self-sustaining once it's up and running with the number of trips that it will run and the passengers that it will attract. This is a little outline of the track. You all are probably mostly familiar with this route. It shows the route from downtown Nashville through Mount Juliet, through Lebanon, up to Watertown, and this shows it going all the way up to Monterey. There are a couple of bridges over the Caney Fork River that are adequate to handle the diesel engines because they're more spread out. They're not adequate to handle the weight of this engine, but the state has recently appropriated some money to rebuild those bridges. So in 34 years, hopefully by the time the engine is ready to be running, those bridges will be capable of handling this engine. As I mentioned, we started out with the lease agreement. The relocation, which I'll show you in just a second, is complete. The engine was moved out of the park and then out to the Tennessee Central Railroad Museum. We're now in the serious fundraising phase and the serious restoration. The engine this week, actually, they're started out to dismantle the engine. They're starting from the top down and taking off all the cladding. Underneath that, as you might guess, is a lot of asbestos, which is one reason it couldn't be done in the park. So it's being done now under a controlled environment. It's going to be taken all the way down to the frame and anything that needs to be done to the boiler, the firebox, and all of those parts will be done. A lot of things have been taken off and worked on. The stoker motor that shovel to move the coal from the tender into the engine. That's been taken off and redone. All of the brake parts, the air compressors, generators, all of that has been done. But again, it's a slow and unfortunately costly process. These are pictures of some of the work sessions actually in the park. That one at the top shows the stoker motor being taken out of the tender. Here are pictures of some of the gauges in the cab of the engine. You can see what the toll over the years has been. Here's what they look like restored. I mean, that's the example of what can be done. I'm a Corvette buff, and it's amazing what people can do with the, everybody dreams about finding an old Corvette in the barn with a tarp over it, and, the brats living in it, and they build it back to a valuable piece of machinery. Well, that's what we're basically doing with this engine. These are pictures of the move out of the park that took place January the 13th. A big moving company from Atlanta, Mamout, which is a Belgian company, did the move. They actually came to us and said, we'd like to help you move your engine. And we said, well, it's pretty big. And they said, not for us. And they move stuff a lot bigger than this engine. But this piece of equipment they used is called a Goldhopper trailer. It's a self-propelled trailer that has 96 wheels under it, so it spreads the weight out. And you'll see pictures. You can. This is actually moving it down Charlotte into the video, and you'll see the guy walking behind. He's actually carrying the little joystick box that controls it. He can move it any way and control the speed, but it moves at walking speed from Centennial Park down just about to where I-40 crosses over Charlotte, where we put it back on the tracks. And then moved it subsequently to where it is now. This is probably the most interesting part of the move. Jacketed up, straight up, they got it up in the air and put the trailer under and laid it back down. This is where we actually put it back on the tracks. And needless to say, it had to be just right to get the wheels on the track. It's like putting anybody had a model train, you know how hard it is to get all the wheels lined up. So my wife and I went down to watch that. I thought, well, they'll have all this elaborate laser equipment and everything, and they were eyeballing it with lead drop lines, and they got it right on the track and dropped it down. So, but that was out just north of that's Nashville Tent and Awnings building right behind it. About 3 weeks ago, it had a historic reunion. It was moved by CSX, first by actually the Nashville and Western Railroad, put it onto the CSX tracks. CSX moved it down and let it spend the night at Union Station. It was the first time the engine had been to Union Station in about 68 years, and we had a good turnout of people who came to see it. We had a VIP afternoon thing, and a lot of folks showed up for that. And then the next morning, the CSX moved it out to connect up with the Nashville and Eastern, and they moved it out. That shows it crossing over one of the crossings on the Nashville and Eastern tracks, the old Tennessee Central. And that's where it is today, is in a shed out in the Tennessee Central Railroad Museum. In fact, you can see some of their cars in the background. The accomplishments to date, we've gotten a lot of regional support, the Metro Council, the Parks Board, the Governor Lee, Mayor Briley, the Nashville Convention Bureau, Trains Magazine, a number of groups, the Nashville and Chattanooga and St. Louis Preservation Society. The Watertown folks I met with about a week ago, their chamber, they're excited about this. I've met with your Convention Bureau people down here. They're excited about it. I've spoken to a number of the Wilson County Rotary and Kiwanis clubs. People are really interested in this. It's going to come right through the middle of your county. In fact, most of the track, about 60% of it that it runs on, will be in Wilson County. We've gotten a lot of media coverage. You probably saw the coverage for the actual move. It had a front page coverage on the Tennessean. It's been on all the local TV stations. It's been in some of the national railroad magazines. In fact, Trains Magazine did a live feed on their website of the actual move. Accomplishments to date, we've raised, I mentioned the $500,000. We've actually up to about between $750,000 and $800,000 today. But unfortunately, we've got a long ways to go. The full cost of the restoration is about $2.5 to $3 million, and that's what we're working on right now, along with the actual restoration. We've had a lot of foundation support. There's one particular foundation in California, the Candelaria Fund, which has been extremely generous. This shows that shows the total foundation at $100,000. The Candelaria Foundation made a $250,000 grant after we moved it out of the park, so that number is low. We've got a number of corporate sponsors, either in-kind sponsorship or financial sponsorship, and individual donors, everything from people just dropping 50 cents in a bucket out at the park to people who've made contributions individually in various amounts from $5 to $5,000 to $50,000. So going forward, as I said, we're beginning the mechanical restoration. We're establishing the educational program. We're working in collaboration with various groups to get them interested and have people come out and actually take part in the process. For Wilson County, there's one additional piece. You can't just take a steam engine and pull it one way and then back up the other direction. It doesn't back up all that well, and you can't see very well out of it backing up. So it's important to have a turntable to turn the engine and have it go the other direction. Some of you may know there used to be a small turntable in Watertown that was part of the Tennessee Central Track. Watertown was looking for a turntable. CSX had one of the turntables that was actually built for this engine and its sisters in the 40s in a yard in Atlanta, which they had been using but decided they didn't need it anymore, and they made a gift to Watertown of the turntable, the actual bridge part of it, the steel part, which interestingly also has a Nashville background. It was built by Nashville Bridge Company in the 40s. So Watertown is working on raising the money to get that turntable installed there in Watertown, right along Highway 70 probably. And they're working on that project. We've actually contributed some money to that. The Nashville and Eastern Railroad has contributed to it, and others, but they have a goal to raise about $500,000 to install the turntable. They also have a plan for a sort of a railroad village right along the tracks and as part of the turntable with a model railroad display, shops, restaurants, and the whole works. They're pretty excited about it, and people will actually come to watch the engine turn on the turntable, because that's a pretty interesting process to take something that large and turn it around. That's a picture of the turntable while it was in use or in the ground in Atlanta. And there's the same company that moved the engine out of the park, brought the turntable up to Watertown, and they shows them unloading it. If you go up there, right past the community center and the fire and police department, it's sitting right beside the highway.
For over 60 years,
this is a little short video that sort of sums up the whole process from our website.
Of South Broadway or on the stage at the Ryman, but on the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway. Number 576's song has been quiet since its final curtain call in 1953, but this is one performance that deserves an encore. The railroad industry has changed mightily in the century since it helped shape Nashville into the metropolis it is today. But one thing remains the same: the allure of the steam locomotive. In the era since they disappeared from mainline railroads everywhere, a few have been remade into spectacular operating tourist attractions. The potential for this same success is in the 576. In 2016, the Nashville Steam Preservation Society announced its plan to relocate, restore, and operate number 576 within the Middle Tennessee region. With a lease agreement in place from the city, an operating partner in the Nashville and Eastern Railroad, assistance from the Tennessee Central Railway Museum, and the help of dozens of experienced railroad professionals and volunteers, Nashville Steam's goal is to raise $2.5 million to create a fantastic new tourist attraction for the region. When restored, number 576 will become a moving, visceral link to the history of Nashville, educating, engaging, and creating incredible experiences for citizens and tourists alike. Even as a static display, the 576 welcomed over 500 people to Centennial Park at Nashville Steam's first open house. Imagine what she could do with a boiler full of steam, 100 miles of railroad, and hundreds of thousands visiting Nashville each year to ride behind the stripe. For more on this special effort, visit NashvilleSteam.org and become a donor or sponsor today.
So that's the story. Thank you all for your time and appreciate your coming.